The winter of 1945 was cruel. Bitter winds swept across a Europe torn apart by years of endless war. Cities lay in ruins, smoke still curling from the shells of what had once been homes. Bridges were gone, farmland bombed, rivers clogged with wreckage. But among the chaos, as the guns thundered and sirens wailed, a strange kind of mission was about to begin. One not destruction, but a compassion. For the first time in years, American B-17 crews, the same men who had rained bombs over Nazi Germany, were preparing to drop something entirely different. Food. Tons of food. And on the ground below, the same German soldiers who once fired at them would stand at attention and salute. It sounds impossible, almost unbelievable, but it really happened. It was a moment when war paused for humanity to take a breath. To understand how this moment came to be, we have to go back to the final days of World War II. Europe was crumbling. The Third Reich, once confident and brutal, was collapsing under the weight of Allied advances. In the West, American and British forces were pushing deeper into Germany. In the East, the Red Army was closing in from the Soviet front. The noose around Hitler's regime was tightening. But in the middle of this dying empire, something tragic was happening. Something that had nothing to do with soldiers or battles. The people of the Netherlands were starving. By late 1944, after a failed Allied operation known as Market Garden, the Dutch found themselves still under Nazi occupation. The Germans, angry at the Dutch resistance and the ongoing Allied support, decided to punish them. They cut off food shipments, flooded farmlands, and destroyed bridges to prevent supplies from reaching cities like Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and The Hague. As the winter set in, the famine deepened. It would later be called the Dutch Hunger Winter. Over 20,000 people died. Families burned their furniture for warmth. People boiled tulip bulbs just to survive another day. Even German soldiers began to realize the suffering around them was unbearable. The Netherlands had become a land of ghosts. Quiet, cold, and hungry. By early 1945, the Allies knew the end of the war was near. But news of the Dutch famine reached London and Washington, and it shocked everyone. The war was almost won, yet thousands of civilians, most of them innocent, were dying from hunger right under Allied bombers. Something had to be done. But how could food be delivered into enemy territory without being shot down? At that time, any Allied aircraft crossing into German-occupied areas risked anti-aircraft fire. The Luftwaffe was crippled but not gone, and the German defenses, desperate, suspicious, and cornered, were still capable of deadly retaliation. So began one of the strangest negotiations of the entire war. Representatives from the Allies and the German forces met secretly through the Red Cross and Swedish intermediaries. The goal: to allow Allied bombers to fly over Nazi-held areas of the Netherlands to drop food supplies without being fired upon. Imagine that for a moment. Men who had spent years killing each other now sitting across a table, agreeing on a mission of mercy. After tense discussions, the Germans agreed. The war wasn't officially over, but they knew the end was inevitable. Some historians say even German officers were moved by the plight of the Dutch civilians. Others believed it was simply a matter of maintaining order in the dying days of the Reich. Whatever the reason, the deal was struck. The mission would go forward. It was codenamed Operation Manna by the Royal Air Force and Operation Chowhound by the U.S. Army Air Forces. The first flights would begin in late April 1945. As the B-17 crews were briefed, the airmen could hardly believe what they were hearing. Many of these men had flown dozens of bombing missions over Germany, missions where friends never returned, missions that left entire cities burning. And now, their orders were the opposite of everything they'd done before. No bombs, no gunfire, just food, flour, sugar, margarine, canned meat, powdered milk, all carefully packed into sacks. Each plane would carry around 6 to 7 tons of food. Still, the risk was real. No matter what agreements were made, there was no guarantee that German gunners wouldn't open fire. Some pilots even wrote farewell letters before the mission, unsure if they'd return. On April 29, 1945, the first bombers took off. They roared over the English coast, crossing the North Sea toward the Dutch shoreline, the same route they'd taken countless times before, but this time, the world felt eerily different. There was no fighter escort, no evasive maneuvers, no flak bursts in the sky, just the deep hum of engines and the sight of a starving nation below. From their cockpits, the airmen could see people rushing out of their houses, waving white sheets and flags. Children danced in the streets. Some were so weak they could barely stand. Then came a moment that would stay with the crews forever. As the bombers approached their designated drop zones, they saw something extraordinary. German soldiers, standing guard on the edges of the fields, lowering their weapons and raising their hands in salute. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't an ambush. It was respect. The men who once fought each other to death were now part of a silent agreement that for one brief moment, humanity was more important than victory. As the bomb bay doors opened, thousands of food parcels cascaded through the sky like golden rain. Sacks of flour and boxes of rations floated down to a people who hadn't tasted bread in months. The B-17s turned for home, their bomb bays empty, but their hearts full. When they landed, the ground crews and officers were silent. There were no cheers, no medals, just quiet realization that in a world gone mad with war, something pure had just happened. But this was only the beginning. Over the following days, hundreds of bombers would join the effort, carrying out mission after mission over the Netherlands. Each flight had its own dangers, surprises, and unforgettable moments, including one encounter so unbelievable, even the most hardened pilots never forgot it. And that's where the real story begins. The first drops of Operation Manna and Chowhound were a success, but no one could quite believe it. The German guns had stayed silent. Not a single aircraft was shot down. The message spread quickly across the bases in England. It worked. Within hours, more missions were approved. The airfields came alive again, but this time not for war. At RAF Woodbridge, Framlingham, and Thorpe Abbotts, crews of B-17 Flying Fortresses and British Lancasters began preparing for a new kind of sortie. Ground crews loaded burlap sacks filled with flour, sugar, biscuits, and tins of meat. Inside some planes, airmen scribbled messages on packages, from the boys of the 8th Air Force, or simply, God bless you. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, hundreds of bombers lifted off again. From above, the Dutch countryside looked peaceful, almost innocent, a deceptive calm in a continent still bleeding from years of war. The pilots flew lower this time, barely 400 feet above the ground, trusting that their German counterparts will hold their fire. And incredibly, they did. One B-17 co-pilot later recalled looking down and seeing German soldiers standing by anti-aircraft guns, not aiming them, but watching silently as the bombers' thunder passed. Some even waved. Others stood at rigid attention, offering a salute. The scene was surreal, like a truce in a dream. In some areas, the Dutch people had gathered in open fields, waving flags and sheets to mark the drop zones. Children chased after the falling packages, laughing and crying at the same time. Villagers loaded carts and bicycles, hauling the precious supplies back to towns where people had forgotten the taste of bread. For the men and the bombers, it was one of the most emotional missions of their lives. They had seen cities burn. They had seen flak tear through their wings. But they had never seen joy like this. One pilot from the 390th Bomb Group later said, "I never thought I'd be cheered by people I wasn't bombing." Over the next week, the missions continued relentlessly. The RAF flew their Lancasters under Operation Manna, while the U.S. 8th Air Force handled Operation Chowhound. Between April 29 to May 8th, they dropped over 11,000 tons of food, enough to keep millions alive. And yet, the missions were not without danger. On several occasions, communication errors nearly led to disaster. Some German units had not received the ceasefire orders or didn't believe them. A few gunners, panicked or defiant, fired at the low-flying bombers. The crews could hear the crack of bullets and the whistle of shells passing by. One B-17 had its wing grazed. Another was hit by ground fire, but managed to return home. Still, compared to thousands of aircraft lost in bombing campaigns, the risk seemed small. The airmen felt they were part of something bigger, something that transcended orders and ranks. One fascinating detail few people know is how the missions were coordinated. The Allies used precise drop corridors, specific paths marked by the Germans themselves to ensure safe passage. These were narrow strips of airspace that cut through occupied zones. Pilots were told not to deviate, not to stray even a mile off course, or they could be mistaken for an attack and shot down. Inside the bombers, the mood was entirely different from a combat flight. No one wore flak jackets. No one manned the guns. The bombardiers didn't have their fingers on triggers, but on release levers that would open the bomb bay doors to pour out food instead of destruction. In the nose compartments of the planes, you could see airmen leaning forward, watching the ground rush beneath them. They could make out individual people, rooftops, even children running between the rows of tulip fields. It was like flying over a different world. And on the ground, the reaction was overwhelming. One Dutch woman, who was just a child at the time, later remembered how she and her sister saw the first bombers appear. The roar of the engines was so loud it shook their small house. They ran outside, thinking at first it was another raid. But then instead of bombs, they saw packages fall into the clouds, brown sacks tumbling toward the fields. Her mother screamed, "They're giving us food!" and burst into tears. People who had gone days without eating anything more than boiled tulip bulbs were now tearing open sacks of flour and sugar with their bare hands. For many, it was the first real meal in months. What made these missions even more astonishing was their timing. The war was in its final days. Adolf Hitler was still alive, hiding in his bunker in Berlin. The world didn't yet know he'd be dead within hours. German forces were surrendering piece by piece. Yet amid that collapse, both sides managed to hold a fragile, unspoken truce long enough to save a nation from starvation. Even the Germans seemed to recognize the humanity of the moment. In one report, a Luftwaffe officer ordered his men not to interfere, writing, "Let them pass. They are feeding civilians." There were even stories of German soldiers helping the Dutch collect and distribute the food. They, too, were hungry. Some of them hadn't been paid or fed properly in weeks. Yet when the bombers flew overhead, they stayed disciplined, saluting in silence. One B-17 pilot recalled seeing a line of German soldiers standing along a road, helmets off, saluting the passing formation. "It gave me chills," he said. These were the same men who had tried to kill us a month earlier. Back in England, the crews would return from each mission changed. They didn't boast or brag the way they sometimes did after bombing raids. Instead, they sat quietly, drinking coffee, thinking about what they had seen. The faces of children, the flags waving, the sight of soldiers saluting instead of shooting. Operation Manna and Chowhound weren't officially combat operations, so the crews didn't earn medals or battle ribbons for them. But many of them said later that it was the most meaningful mission they ever flew. And there were small details, tiny human moments, that stuck in their memories. Some airmen remembered seeing people spell out giant messages on rooftops using bedsheets. "Thank you, boys." Others saw children drawing hearts in the dirt or waving little flags made from rags and sticks. In the villages, priests rang church bells as the bombers passed. Even as artillery echoed far away, people sang. It was as if for those few days, the war had stopped, replaced by something sacred. By the beginning of May 1945, the food drops had become a lifeline. Thousands who might have died in the final weeks of famine survived because of those missions. And as word spread across Europe, they became a symbol, proof that even amid war's darkest hour, mercy could still find its way through the clouds. But just as this extraordinary story seemed to reach its peaceful rhythm, a twist was waiting. Because in the middle of one flight, a squadron of B-17s made an unexpected encounter with none other than German fighter planes. And what happened next would leave every man in those bombers speechless. The morning sky over the Netherlands was calm, soft, and gray. The formation of B-17 flying fortresses cruised low over the Dutch coast, bomb bays open, food sacks ready to drop. The crews had grown used to the quiet now, the strange calm that came with these mercy missions. But this time, something appeared in the distance. Tiny black dots against the horizon, moving fast. At first, the pilots thought it might be other Allied aircraft, maybe RAF Lancasters joining from another route. But within seconds, the truth hit them. German fighters. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek, deadly, and diving straight toward them. The crews froze. Every instinct screamed to break formation, to take evasive action. But these were unarmed planes. Their guns were unmanned, their bomb bays full of food instead of bombs. They had no protection. One gunner shouted over the intercom, "They're coming right at us." But then something unbelievable happened. The German fighters didn't open fire. Instead, they leveled off, flying alongside the B-17s, wings steady, engines humming. The pilots on both sides could see each other clearly now. Young men, faces pale from exhaustion and disbelief. One American co-pilot, peering through his cockpit window, saw a German pilot motioning with his hand. For a moment, he thought it was a warning or a threat. Then he realized the German was giving a thumbs up. Another German fighter moved closer, almost wingtip to wingtip, before gently rocking his wings. A salute in the air. Down below, on the ground, Dutch civilians watched as American bombers and German fighters flew together in perfect formation. A scene that seemed to defy every rule of war. No shots fired. No pursuit. Just respect. Some historians later said the Germans were there to make sure the bombers weren't attacked by rogue units. Others believed the fighter pilots, knowing the war was lost, simply wanted to witness the mission, to see for themselves this final act of humanity. Whatever their reason, it became one of the most haunting and beautiful moments of the war. As the German fighters peeled away, the bombers continued their drop. From the bellies of the great silver planes poured life. Sacks of flour, boxes of biscuits, tins of butter, falling like blessings from the sky. The ground below erupted in cheers and tears. When the bombers turned for home, the German fighters dipped their wings one last time, then vanished into the clouds. That was the last time many of those men would ever see one another. Within days, Germany would surrender. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was over. On May 5, 1945, the Netherlands was officially liberated. For the Dutch, the end of the war came not with gunfire or tanks, but with food falling from the heavens. The famine was finally broken, and though tens of thousands had already perished, millions more lived because of those missions. In total, more than 11,000 tons of food were dropped during Operations Manna and Chowhound. Over 5,000 sorties were flown, and not a single aircraft was lost to enemy fire. When the war ended, the Dutch people never forgot. In the years that followed, letters and gifts poured into the homes of the pilots who had flown those mercy missions. Some of the airmen even returned to the Netherlands after the war, where they were greeted like heroes. One pilot, decades later, recalled walking through a small Dutch village where an elderly woman stopped him and said softly, "You were one of the men who brought us bread. I was a girl then. You saved my family." He said he had to turn away so she wouldn't see him cry. There's another incredible detail, one that shows how deeply this act touched people. In 1945, just weeks after the war, Dutch children sent handmade thank-you cards to the Allied bases in England. They drew B-17s and Lancasters with parachutes carrying bread and milk, surrounded by hearts and tulips. Some of those cards still survive today, framed in museums. In one letter, a child wrote, "When you dropped food, my mother said angels were flying over our house." But perhaps the most powerful legacy of all is how those airmen themselves spoke about it afterward. For years, veterans of the 8th Air Force and the RAF talked about the bombing campaigns, about the destruction they'd seen. But when they spoke of Operation Manna or Chowhound, their tone always changed. They would smile softly, their eyes distant. One said, "It was the first time I ever felt proud to be a bomber pilot." The missions also had an unexpected effect on the Germans who witnessed them. Many of those soldiers returned home broken and disillusioned, but they carried that memory of the enemy dropping food, not bombs. It reminded them that even in defeat, decency could still exist. After the war, when the Netherlands rebuilt, the memory of those days became sacred. In some places, they called it the bread from heaven. In 2015, 70 years after the missions, the Dutch government held a grand commemoration. Surviving Allied airmen, now in their 90s, returned to the same airfields they had once flown over. Crowds gathered to honor them not as warriors, but as saviors. Modern aircraft flew overhead, dropping symbolic food parcels wrapped in the colors of the Dutch flag. Among the spectators were children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of those who had lived through the famine. Generations who were alive because of that act of mercy. When one of the old pilots was interviewed, his voice trembled as he said, "I dropped bombs for 2 years, but that 1 week, when we dropped food, that's what I want to be remembered for." It's easy in the long shadow of history to think of war as nothing but hate and violence. But this story, the story of the mission where B-17 crews dropped food instead of bombs and the German soldiers saluted, proves something different. It shows that even at the edge of destruction, humanity can still shine through. That even in a world torn apart by war, compassion can cross the front lines. And that sometimes the greatest victories don't come from winning battles, but from choosing not to fight. As the engines of those bombers faded into the sky, the people below looked up and saw not enemies, but men who, for a few precious days, reminded the world that kindness can survive even in the darkest times. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real end of the war.